Welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Vince, and we are going to talk about episode 5 in my End Time Bible Fulfillment study in sequential order. And this study is entitled The War. It is Antichrist taking on two kings. In Daniel, it talks about the Antichrist would be replacing two other horns in his vision. We are going to look into when it is likely to start, where it is likely to start, rather, what it is all about. Is it because the temple is going live? And we will cover details on this tribulation war of the three kings. Remember, Antichrist wanted to establish himself peacefully, but apparently something's going to go bad. And in that, we have the war. Sit tight. My name is Vince. I really look forward to sharing this one with you. Okay, we need to ask ourselves a question now. Before we get into the war, we need to ask ourselves, is it a possibility that the temple going back into operation is what provokes this particular war? There are many scholars that believe so. I'm not so convinced, but I could say it is a possibility. A small one, but it is a possibility. Now, let me say this. Antichrist signed this covenant with the nation of Israel. We know that when the covenant was signed, according to the book of Revelation and this description of the white horse rider, that he wanted to establish his dominance or his rule peaceably. He did not want a war, but now he is going to get pressured into one. And what we know about the two other nations, who I will shortly explain who they are, is they have a high concentration of Muslim people. The Muslim people are dominant. So it could be a possibility that this war starts because of the people being angered about it, but even more so that we need to consideration, and very odd, the temple does go into operation right around the time that the hostilities start. Now, I'm going to say that we are going to build a number of days to be able to get an idea when the temple goes back online. We know that the tribulation period, the last 7 years of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 years, are waiting to be fulfilled. Those years total 2,520 days using the Jewish lunar calendar. Now, the midpoint is referred to as the Great Tribulation period. And this is where we are able to start our building or our counting, because at the time of the abomination of desolation, which happens at the midpoint, Christ mentions it in Matthew 27, there are a total of 1,260 days. And these days are talked about in Daniel 12, verses 5 through 7, and you'll also find them in the book of Revelation, the second half of the tribulation period. Now, what is interesting about this is it tells us from this point, the abomination of desolation, there are 30 more days added afterward, and at that particular point, the sacrifice is reinstated. So, from the time of the abomination of desolation, there are a total of 1,290 days, according to Daniel 12:11, when this sacrifice is restored. So, what we have here from the time that the tribulation starts is a total of 2,550 days. And it is at that 2,550th day, that is the point where the sacrifice is restored. Now, because I have this 2,550 days, I can go into another scripture verse and give us an answer to when the temple will be back into operation. All right. All right. When is it back into operation is given by looking at Daniel 8, verses 12 through 14. Now, in order to save time as I read this verse, I'm just going to go ahead and pull out a few points to give us an idea what is going on here. It says, on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Now, the it here is the horn. Now, what do we know is, according to Daniel, there's three horns, and the prominent horn, the Antichrist here, is going to be allowed to be over and control the host because of transgression. And the host here is the nation of Israel. So because the nation of Israel is in sin, God is giving over. Isn't that funny? He gives over the Antichrist and the sacrifice to him. And as a result of it, for about 3.5 years, he is going to prosper. Now, this is something that we need to take into consideration, because this temple was never ordained by God. God never wanted it. We looked at an earlier video. We talked about Isaiah 66 and where it mentioned this. He didn't need it. He has Jesus Christ for the atonement of people. Now it says in verse 13 here, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply? So we know here Daniel is getting this in a vision, and there is an important question coming out. Remember, we know when the sacrifice was going to be reinstated, and that was 1290 days after the abomination of desolation. So he asked this question, how long will the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And he said to me, for 2300 evenings and morning, then the holy place will be properly restored. There's that word restored, the same as we had in Daniel 12:11. Now what he's simply saying is 2300 days, evenings and morning. Jewish day starts at the night and ends when the sun goes down the next day. So you have evening and morning one day. So let me tell you about what's going on here. Both the holy place and the host are trampled for 2300 days. So this is clearly the unsanctioned temple that is trampled. But what happens is when we take that 2300 days and we deduct them from 2550 days, we get a total of 250 days, or 8.3 months from the start of the tribulation period, and that is its likely point of going online. So therefore, it's probably going to be in the month of Elul, which is typically August or early September, but there are a total of 250 days from the beginning point of the tribulation until the temple is now active. It is online and active. And oddly enough, it will just precede shortly before the high holy days of Israel. Okay, let's get into the war. So, where does the war start and how does it start? First of all, whenever there was a crisis in the Middle East, something started with Israel or something started in the Middle East, like when we went into the Persian Gulf, people would always ask me, is this it? Is this the final 7 years? Are we at that point? And it's obvious there's no covenant signed with the Antichrist, but that's got to happen first. But the reality of it is the war will not start in the Middle East. It actually will get going in Egypt. And because of what happens in Egypt, the happening will occur that the Middle East will become affected, and we will have our war concerning one ruler in Africa and one ruler in the Middle East. So let me talk about where the war starts, and that is in Egypt. It is in Egypt that the war will begin. Now, how that war starts is given to us in Isaiah 19, verses 1 through 4. I didn't knock out part of verse 3, but I wanted to cover the key points here, and that's the main reason for it. And I will make some comments as I read along the way. The oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. Now, I want to reiterate here that it's something key. Things are instigated in the spirit realm, not in the physical realm. So God is causing something to happen here, and it will have an effect not on statues trembling, but literally the word here is talking about the idols will tremble. So the idols here are specifically saying, hey, look, this is about the spirits that control the Gentile world that are under Satan. They are getting fearful at the presence of what the Lord is doing. And as a result of that, the heart of the Egyptians living on land in our physical realm begins to melt. They begin to worry. And so it says here in verse 2, I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will each fight against his brother, and each against his neighbor, and city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Now, what's key here is how it starts. It starts on a local level between people within the nation of Egypt, arguing against each other. Could that be because of the temple being in operation? Well, no, we don't know, because it doesn't tell us what the argument is about. It just tells us that they argue with each other. But it could be because, oddly enough, this is within the same window that the temple goes into operation. But then it goes on to say city against city. Now, what's interesting about this is there is not people attacking Israel like we used to see, but within a nation attacking each other. It is a civil war that is beginning here in one of the kingdoms of the 10 nation confederacy, and that kingdom is Egypt. And then we also see that eventually it will turn into a kingdom against kingdom war. So, in other words, it will go outside of Egypt and affect at least one other nation. And when this happens, then the spirit of the Egyptians will be demoralized. They become totally without hope. Without explaining the rest of verse 3, they look for hope in other areas and they do not find it. But it says then in verse 4, moreover, I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a cruel master, a mighty king will rule over them, declares the Lord God of hosts. So, in essence, who's doing the delivering of the Egyptians here? It is God. And who's he turning them over to? Well, just like he turned over the host at the temple, the people of Israel, to the Antichrist, he will turn over the rule of Egypt to the Antichrist. And here is a king that is going to be about to be displayed. He is in Egypt. Hasn't happened yet, but stay tuned. So let's talk about how this thing could escalate into a full war with other countries. Now, one of the things that becomes important, we know it starts in Egypt. It spreads in Egypt. So somehow this particular war may be the element that affects the Antichrist. Could this be a war about the temple going online? Well, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But oddly, again, this is all within the same window of time going on as the Antichrist begins to get in some way involved. Now, let us first understand that we are taking a tidbit of verses here in Daniel chapter 11. But if you look at Daniel chapter 11, throughout almost the entirety of that chapter, there are certain kings that are mentioned. It mentions a king of the north and it mentions a king of the south. Historically, it gives a history, or I should say a prehistory, of events that would happen because Daniel is writing before they happen. And because they are so biblically accurate, we know Daniel's writings are true. He gives us the prehistory of wars that would go on between the king of Egypt and the king of the north, which is the king of Syria. Now, these two kings were more normally fighting each other, but some changes around the last days. In Daniel 11:35, there are certain verses that bring the Antichrist and the end time into the picture. Daniel 35 starts mentioning the end time. Then it goes in throughout verses 36 and 39, talking about the character of the Antichrist, what the Antichrist is like. We don't want to focus so much on the character or the personality of the Antichrist here. Our focus is the war today. And that's so I just wanted to mention that so you could understand what precedes the next verse, which is Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. And this is what it said. Now, in verse 35, it started talking about the end time. And here it says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south contend with him. Since it was talking about the Antichrist before this verse, the him here is referring to the Antichrist. So the king of the south, which again is the king of Egypt, in some way gets in a confrontation with the Antichrist. Then it goes on to tell us the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. So of course we're looking at this as military equipment. And when it says the king of the north, it's saying the king of Syria will come against the king of Assyria, which is the Antichrist, like a whirlwind, with many horsemen and chariots and with many ships. Then it says, and he, okay, since the last person mentioned was the Antichrist, him is the antecedent, he is the Antichrist being talked about here, shall enter into the countries. Countries, two countries. So it's not Syria entering Iraq and another country. It is the Antichrist entering into Syria, and then he will enter into the country of the king of the south, which is Egypt. And it says that he shall overflow and pass through. The Septuagint says he will break in pieces and pass on. So, in other words, it is describing who wins here. The victor is the Antichrist. Now, let me just mention in Daniel 7:24, we now begin to have a fulfillment, because when he defeats the king of he defeats the king of Syria. The king of Assyria now also becomes the ruler of that particular nation. So he is replacing one of the two horns that is mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 verse 24. Furthermore, he will soon supplant the king of Egypt and replace him as a dominant ruler. Now understand, later on, he's going to put in a couple puppet rulers with him, but he is going to be the ruler of these three nations. Now in Daniel 11:41, it tells us that he shall also enter into the glorious land. He will enter into Israel. That is a glorious land. So let's try to build a picture going on. If you have it on screen, you might want to look at the map. The war starts with Egypt. Egypt obviously seems to work toward getting Syria involved in the war, which causes Syria to get into a mode where he does a full-scale military attack on the Antichrist. The Antichrist responds, and this is very important here because the Antichrist is the one who is attacked. It is not the Antichrist that is doing a attack on the other nation. He is simply counterattacking in defense of his nation. He did not want to get into a war. He wanted to conquer peacefully. Yet there is a clash, and in that clash, what happens? Syria loses. And from that, we are told that he goes and he passes into the country. So now he becomes an occupier of Syria. Now, whether or not Egypt made it there to support him, we can't be sure in any case. But Egypt could not go directly through Israel, could not go through Jordan. It had to come by sea. And that would tell me that if it gave any kind of support to Syria, it wasn't much. But now, because the occupier, the Antichrist, the king of Assyria, is now occupying and sitting on the throne as ruler of Syria, he needs to contend, or he needs to deal with the king of Egypt. Therefore, he shifts his focus. He moves from Syria, getting Israel's permission most likely. I doubt that he would go through without the permission of Israel, but he enters into the land, the glorious land of Israel, and now must focus on the king of Egypt. The king of Egypt, in defense of his country, having started the war, probably weakened by the civil war that was going on, shifts into attacking the Antichrist. As a result, there is a clash. The king of Egypt is defeated and broken into pieces, and from there, Antichrist passes through another country. So you could see now he would be in control of three countries: Iraq, he would be in control of Syria, and he would be in control of Egypt. Okay, what you've just seen happen is a nation coming against another nation. Now, that happens all the time. But here in Matthew 24, verse 7, something that doesn't happen is it results in kingdom versus kingdom. So far, it's only happened twice. Some people believe that there will be another world war before the final days of the tribulation period. It's possible, but I can't be so sure. But I will say that it is a possibility. Now, what we have coming soon is the part of Matthew 24, verse 7, that says, then kingdom will rise against kingdom. So these are the beginning of birth pangs now starting to happen. And if we understand what's going on, we are now moving in that direction. We know, according to Daniel 11:41, that he will also enter the land of Israel, the beautiful land. and many countries will fall. Now, these countries do not necessarily fall by him fighting Egypt and Syria, but these would be rescued out of his hand. These countries that don't fall, and obviously it's implying many of the Middle Eastern countries will fall, but the ones that don't fall are Edom, Moab, and the foremost sons of Ammon, which is Jordan. So Jordan is being rescued from the king of Assyria's hand, from the ruler of Iraq's hand, in order to be put there as a escape area for the nation of Israel during the second half of the tribulation period. We will cover that in the future. Then Antichrist, he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. There's an implication here that he enters Egypt twice. Now we'll get into that possibility again later on. Because we're doing this in a chronological order, some of the verses we covered today regarding the kingdom against kingdom will need to be covered again in the future. Now, let me say this. The Bible is very ambiguous. Things are spread out in tidbits between different prophets. Some information may come from Jeremiah, some might come from Isaiah, some might come from Zechariah. We don't know who it's going to come from. And so sometimes we have to put the pieces of the puzzle together to give us the bigger picture. So there are things within these verses that we will come back to later on. Now, I mentioned here in 42b that the land of Egypt will not escape, where he already said he entered and passed through the land of Egypt in the previous verse. So therefore, what the implication would suggest here is that he leaves and returns to the land of Egypt. It says, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. And then it says, the Libyans and the Ethiopians will follow at his footsteps. Now, what this is telling us is very easy with Libya, because Libya is right next to Egypt. As he's getting close to Libya, and as he's getting close to leaving or exiting to the southern border of Egypt, whatever country that might be today may be part of Ethiopia, or at least they might be descendants of the Ethiopians. And when he gets close to those countries, they follow at his heels, or as other Bible translations say, he is at their steps. He is within steps away. It's about to get there. But here's where things begin to change. And this is a verse we are going to have to come back to in our next video. It says in verse 44 here, but rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he, the Antichrist, will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Therefore, there is something while he is in Egypt, while he has almost gone entirely to the border of these other countries, that makes him turn around and go back, because he has to go forth, because the attack coming from the east is implied to come from the direction of Iran, and the attack coming from the north could be any nation from the north, but we will see who that nation is, or nations, later on, because we are entering the kingdom versus kingdom stage. I really do not want you to miss our next episode, episode 6. And what is going to happen is we are going to see how the war expands. The first kingdom enters the war. Now, I want to invite you to subscribe so you don't miss it. Maybe email other people about this video you might think will be interested. And now let's get into our so now what portion, the application side of this video. And there are certain points that we need to make. These are the points I'm hoping you'll want to remember. Now, in Daniel 8:12, it said there that God gave over Israel, the host, and he gave over the sacrifice to the Antichrist. And what I want us to hopefully remember that God granted this. God gave it over to him. We have to start looking at God as being the one here that is in control. At a time where the world is going to be falling more and more into sin till we get to these days, God is in control. Another point to support this thing about God being in control was what we saw in Isaiah 19:4, and it says, God will deliver the Egyptians over to a cruel ruler. Yes, over to the Antichrist. It didn't say the Antichrist took the Egyptians there. It said God delivered them. Who's in control? God's in control. Right now, you might think your life is out of control, but by faith, if you look toward God, you will know that He is in control. One more point about God being in control. God rescues Jordan. We also saw that in what we read in today's study in Daniel chapter 11. If God can rescue Jordan, he can rescue you. So just remember always, no matter how bad things look, God is in control. I'd like to invite you to watching all the other videos on end time Bible fulfillments in sequential order. The playlist link is in the details section of this video. Now we are going to ask you to consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one that is coming up, and that is The War Expands. And we will see how the first kingdom enters the war, causing others to join in. Thanks again. My name is Vince, and have a very blessed week.